Hi everyone, welcome back to English for You. I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
And as we saw in part 1 of our article yesterday, different countries have different approaches or feelings about punctuality.
Absolutely. In some places, in some countries, you can be late. That's totally okay. Places like Malaysia or certainly Brazil. But in others, this will be thought of as rude and disrespectful. In other cultures, punctuality or being on time is important, and if you're late, people would think that's something you might have to apologize for or say sorry about.
Yes, especially in Japan. In Japan, you must be on time. If a train there is even 10 seconds late, the train company will apologize and, as Mike said, give a note to the people on the train to prove that they have a reason for their being late.
That's right, because trains are never late. Now, the same is true in South Korea. So Japan, South Korea, kind of similar. That's not too surprising. People in Korea are expected to be on time. Whereas in Brazil, that's kind of at the other end of the scale.
Unless people say English time.
Oh.
If it's English time, then you're expected to be on time. But if it's not, you can be late.
Interesting.
We also learned that in China, being up to 10 minutes late is acceptable.
Okay.
That's fine. You won't get anybody angry for being up to 10 minutes late.
It's interesting. It doesn't say if you should apologize in China if you're 10 minutes late. So maybe that just means you don't have to. No one would be surprised or shocked. Then in Malaysia, people are expected to be late and don't need to apologize for it. So even if you show up on time, people might be surprised and go, why are you here so early? You'd say, I'm on time, but everyone else will be late. It's expected. And it says in Malaysia, if they say, I'll be there in 5 minutes, what they really mean is I'll be there in 1 hour.
Wow.
So remember that when you're going on a date in Kuala Lumpur.
Now today we're going to explore this idea, see a few more examples, and look at the reasons why different countries feel different ways. Let's check it out.
Reading.
Are you late? That depends on where you're from. Why are there so many differences? The reasoning can vary, but a lot of it comes down to the history and environment of the country. Germany, for example, was one of the first countries to become industrial. Factory workers must start on time. If they don't, the machines don't start on time, which costs money. This is why even today, Germans value punctuality. In the Nigerian countryside, there are few machines, and people do most of the farm work. If work starts late, it's not a big deal. Instead, workers need to be able to work around a changing environment. They may have trouble working due to a lack of water, flooding, soil wearing away, or even bugs. Bosses must have good, reliable relationships with their workers to make a profit. In Nigeria, therefore, flexibility is seen as more valuable than punctuality. In summary, punctuality can be viewed very differently depending on where you're from. Of course, these are generalizations, and everyone is different. Nevertheless, these are things to remember when dealing with people from other parts of the world.
All right, so as we've seen yesterday and as we explained just now, there are many cultural differences around the world between countries and nations about what it means to be on time. So the article for today begins with a really good question. Why are there so many differences? Why are Brazilian people late and, German people on time, Japanese people super on time, and Malaysian people, not so much?
It is a good question.
Yeah.
And the article says the reasoning can vary. In other words, there are a lot of reasons.
Okay.
But a lot of this differences or these differences, the differences in attitude, a lot of it comes down to the history and environment of the country.
Interesting.
So there we saw the word vary. If something varies, it changes. It could be one thing here and another thing here. It could look like one thing here and look like something else here. There is variation, which is the noun form. There are lots of different types, colors, sizes, opinions, attitudes, feelings, and so on. For example, we might say, apples vary in size, color, and taste. Big ones and small ones, red and green, sweeter ones and not so sweet, and more.
Softer and crispier, all sorts of, yeah, they really do vary, and people have their own choices and own tastes. And a lot of this does come down to where you are in the world. When we use this expression to come down to something, we use it to express the underlying reason, sort of the main or the basic reason or the basic cause for something. We're kind of cutting out all of the other different little things that might vary and looking for the one thing that might be true for all. And often this is kind of the simple, basic explanation or reason for something happening or for explaining the way something is.
Right, and this is to do with kind of cultural and environment factors.
Yeah, okay.
So let's check out one of these. Germany.
All right, they're on time,
yes,
right?
Germany are on time.
Right,
And we
that's
see
what I would
Germany,
think.
for example,
Yeah.
was one of the first countries to become industrial.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh.
Now here, industrial means having to do with industry, but we use it to mean having lots of different industries, usually highly developed ones with, machines and factories, building things more quickly, more efficiently, using modern technology to do stuff and so on. Think of the Industrial Revolution when people kind of stopped doing everything by hand and started to use a lot more machines and steam power and other kinds of power and so on. For example, we could say Japan only started to become fully industrial at the end of the 19th century. It was a slow change there. So Germany was one of the first countries that really started to go, okay, factories, machines, this kind of more efficient process of making and building things.
Exactly. So where people were working had a big effect on this. Factory workers must start on time, right? Anyone who's had a job in a store, a business of some kind, they don't kind of say, oh, come in during the morning. No, they'll say 9 o'clock. You work from 9 to 5. He works from 5 to 12. So you must start on time. This is an important part and something we've come to sort of accept and be, we're used to it. It's normal for us. But back in the days when people were working on farms and in the fields, it didn't really matter if you started at 8 o'clock or 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But once people got into the Industrial Revolution, working in cities and big factories, being on time became much more important. And why is that?
Well, the article explains if they don't, if workers don't start on time, the machines don't start on time, which costs money.
And even if some of the workers there, if not all of the workers there, they can't really do their job, right?
Yeah.
If you're building the car and the guy who puts the doors on isn't there, everything's going to stop. So being on time is important. But if you're cutting down the hay, it doesn't really matter. This is why even today Germans value punctuality. Yes, Germans are on time when they're thinking about going places, having appointments, showing up at work, all of that stuff.
Okay, so now let's look at a contrasting example.
Okay.
In the Nigerian countryside, there are few machines and people do most of the farm work.
This is a pre-industrial area.
Yeah,
before kind of factories and all that.
Yeah, they don't have lots of machines to go and cut down the crops. They've got people out there cutting things, digging and doing all that.
Sure.
And it happens in the countryside. The countryside is a rural area. It's away from the big cities. There are large fields, patches of woodland and trees and stuff. Only a few roads, small villages, but no big areas of built-up land and houses and streets and all the rest.
Farms.
Exactly. So we could say, for example, Jethro has lived his whole life in the countryside, So visiting the big city made him nervous.
Wow, and he was probably late for everything.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't really being on time or being punctual. Now, if you do work in the countryside in a rural area on a farm, for example, if work starts late, it's not a big problem. It's not a big deal, it says. If work starts late, it's not a big deal. Or if you start, making things out of wood in your little village workshop or something, it's not a big deal. As long as you get the work done, it doesn't really matter. Big deal. This idiom means it's important. It's something that you need to pay attention to. It's something that you definitely are going to want to know about. If something happened in the world and it's a big deal, you can bet it will be in the newspaper the next day or something like that. Or if someone tells you, don't forget this, it's a big deal if you make a mistake on this, then you really do need to pay attention. So a big deal is really important.
Yeah, but showing up on time and working to a clock is not a big deal in the farms in the country in Nigeria.
Interesting.
We see in the article, instead, workers need to be able to work around a changing environment. So they need to work around things, which means they've got to adapt to changes. Something happens, all right, we got to do things a bit differently. We've got to continue working, but we just have to work. Maybe we stop for a bit. Maybe we work quicker because it's going to rain later.
Right.
You just change what you're doing to make sure the work continues no matter what other things are going on.
Okay, on a rainy day, you can show up a little later. If it's been raining for 3 days and suddenly it's sunny, you might have to go in really early because you have a lot of work to do. And then there's other things. It says they may have trouble working due to a lack of water, flooding, soil wearing away, or even bugs. These are all things that would not bother a factory worker. They don't have to worry about this. They just have to make sure the machines work on time. But if you work outside in the rural countryside areas, yeah, you'll have a lot more things around you in the environment that will affect your work and when you do it.
Okay, now let's talk about today's language in focus. So the grammar point we're going to concentrate on today is this phrase, have trouble doing something, or have problems doing something, or have a hard time doing something. It's used to show when something is difficult for a person, that it's a struggle. They don't find it easy to do or finish. And we always use the V-ing form of the verb after this phrase. You have a hard time seeing something. You have a hard time understanding a class. You have a hard time finishing all this food. And here's one more example. Tommy has a hard time waking up early in the mornings because he's a heavy sleeper. So one of the things that causes problems in the Nigerian countryside is flooding.
That is very interesting. But yeah, I guess if you're working on a farm, flooding would definitely stop work for a few days, because flooding is when rivers overflow, there's too much rain, a typhoon rolls in, and lots of rain falls in a very short time, and the rivers can't carry it away. So water starts to go out into the land, into areas where it shouldn't go. That is called a flood. So we can talk about disasters like an earthquake, a typhoon, a flood. And when a flood happens, there will be flooding in a certain area. I think the news recently, a couple months ago, there was a lot of flooding in Western Canada, near where my family lives. And knocked out bridges and all that kind of stuff. So flooding can be very expensive. It doesn't usually kill many people, but it can be very expensive, and it can also bring a lot of trouble to people who live or work in those areas, because suddenly there's water everywhere and you don't want that. For example, there has been a lot of rain recently, and flooding is becoming a problem for the farmers. Yeah, absolutely. I think we notice in Taiwan that after typhoons, the price of vegetables often go up, and a lot of that can be due to flooding.
Yeah, it ruins the crops. They can't be harvested. They just get damaged, whatever.
Right.
And another problem they have, and many farmers have, is when the soil wears away.
Okay.
Now, if something wears away, it's kind of slowly reduced over time by this constant sort of application of weak forces. It's not, it's a big push, an earthquake. No. It's like it's windy all the time, and that slowly wears it down. There's rain and water passing. Think of how a big stone over several thousands of years would become a smaller stone if it's in a river.
Right.
It would become very smooth and round, and it would get smaller over time. And this happens to the soil. The water, the rain, other things cause the soil to gradually sort of get flooded away and disappear.
I see, and of course that's very bad for the farms because a lot of that soil is the good, healthy soil they need to grow their plants and crops. And here's another thing that people there have to deal with. Bosses must have good, reliable relationships with their workers to make a profit. It's a good point. I mean, if you have a bunch of workers who can't work for 2 or 3 days because of flooding, and then suddenly the weather dries up, the sun comes out, you need those workers to come back. You can't call them and say, "Where are you? Well, you're working at the McDonald's now. No, I need you here in my field picking fruit," or whatever. So they need these workers to be reliable, but the workers also need money coming in. They need that to be reliable. Because if something is reliable, this basically means you can trust it, you can depend on it, it will be there when you need it. It could be a person, your reliable friend will always help you out when you're moving house or when you need someone to drive you to the train station or something like that. If you have a watch that's always breaking down and always tells you the wrong time, you'll probably throw that watch away or get it fixed because it's not reliable, right? When you look at something, when you have a machine, you want it to work. When you need it to work, you want it to be reliable and not the opposite, unreliable, where you can't trust it, you can't depend on it.
Yeah, and without a good, reliable relationship between a boss and the workers so they understand each other and work together, there won't be any profit. Let's find out what that word means. So profit is the money that is left after expenses are paid. It's not the same as income. Income is money coming in, but then you'll have to use some of that money to pay for things, electricity, wages, and so on. And profit is what's left after all that paying has been done. So in a restaurant, they get all this money, but then they have to pay for the food, pay for the workers, pay for the cleaning up. If there's any money left after everything's been taken care of, that's the profit. And so if you're a business, you want to have big profits. Here's an example sentence. Jamie's restaurant closed after 2 years because it never made a profit. So therefore, bosses and workers, they need to work together. They can't just be, "Oh, no, I'm 9 to 5 and that's it." They need to do things differently.
Interesting. So it says in Nigeria, therefore, flexibility is seen as more valuable than punctuality. Sure, in Germany, they want a punctual worker who will show up on time. In Nigeria, in the countryside, you want workers who are flexible or who have flexibility. All right, flexible would be the adjective, flexibility is the noun. When we talk about flexibility, we can think about our bodies. We have flexibility. If you do yoga, you might have more flexibility. If you can touch your toes, that's showing good flexibility. If you can put your leg behind your head, that's showing amazing flexibility. When we talk about this word in the world, when we're not talking about our bodies and things that bend, we're talking about things that can shift and change and adapt and things like that. If you show flexibility in your work schedule, your boss lets you kind of come to work kind of any time you want. Maybe you can stay home and do your work. You don't have to be there 9 to 5 every day, Monday to Friday. You can kind of change and do things a little bit differently. You don't get stuck in one system or one way of doing things. So these workers would have to have other ways to make money, and when the boss needs them, they're able to stop doing that work and come to the field. They have to have some flexibility.
Yeah, maybe sometimes they'll be doing really long days,
right?
Or different jobs and
sometimes
so on.
2 days with no work.
Yeah, and that is a valuable thing. Valuable can mean worth a lot of money, or valuable can mean very important, very useful.
Right.
I guess in our article, it sort of means both.
Kind of does.
Yeah, it's an important quality that's useful to the bosses and workers, and that means it'll be worth a lot of money when all the work is done.
It's true. I guess the workers could get paid a little bit more if they have flexibility in their schedule, because the boss, they can be very reliable for the boss. In summary, as we wrap up the article, in summary, punctuality can be viewed very differently depending on where you're from and also where you live and what kind of job you do.
Indeed.
Yeah. In summary, when we say that at the end of an article or at the end of a paragraph or even at the end of just a short couple of sentences, we're kind of wrapping things up. This is a little flag, a little sign saying, okay, we're almost at the end of this. I'm giving you the main basic ideas one more time, or giving you one simple sentence that kind of explains everything I've said just before. So it's a good thing to pay attention to. So, in summary, the example sentence reads, global warming is the biggest threat facing mankind at this moment. I probably had paragraphs or pages or even a whole book before that talking about the dangers of global warming. Now I'm wrapping it up by saying it's really serious.
And this kind of punctuality, as we said, it changes. People's feelings about it change depending on where they're from, what they do.
Right.
We use this phrase depending on to say that the answer or the subject may change when the situation changes. Things are not always the same because circumstances are different, and circumstances cause changes.
They do.
So the jobs I do in a day, the different assignments, will change depending on whether we're at the start of the magazine issue, when I'm writing articles, or the end, when we're just checking everything one last time.
Okay, or the clothes that you wear when you leave the house every day, they depend on what the weather will be like.
Yeah.
Wear shorts on a hot day, a heavy jacket on a cold day. It all depends on the changing weather. Of course, the article says, these are generalizations and everyone is different. Sure, you can probably find a factory worker in Nigeria who has to be very punctual, and you can probably find a farmer in Germany who can go to work whenever he wants and stay home on a rainy day and has to be flexible, but these are generalizations. They're mostly true for most situations. Yeah, so a generalization is basically when we take something and kind of put it in its most basic way. Sure, there are little differences around the outside, there are strange situations that might come along, but when we make a generalization, we're kind of saying that this is something that is probably true for the big group, a bigger group of people than anyone else. For example, you could say, oh, all teenagers love to spend time on their cell phones and social media. Well, many of them do. Most of them maybe do. But of course, you'll find some who do not. But as a generalization, as a way of kind of looking at it as a big picture, this is true.
So yeah, these are general truths. So yes, people will be different, but it's a general truth. And the article finishes by saying, nevertheless, these are things to remember when dealing with people from other parts of the world. So yes, not all Japanese will say you have to be on time, but if you're doing a business deal with a Japanese company, you better be on time.
It would be a good idea.
Better safe than sorry. And we use this word nevertheless to kind of say, despite what has just been said, you know, this is still true, but there is another side to things as well. So yes, not everybody is following this generalization, but knowing about the culture's punctuality and how they figure and how they think about being late or on time, that is really important when you're dealing with them. You don't want to show disrespect. And that brings us to the end of today's article, and so it's time for our For You Chat question.
For You Chat.
So our question is, in Taiwan, here, how many minutes after the agreed time can you arrive before you're considered late? Why do you think this is?
Interesting. I think it kind of depends on where you're going and who's waiting for you. I mean, I know people here who will call me if I'm 1 minute late or 2 minutes late. And I always think that's a little crazy. But then there's other people who, if you're half an hour late, they'll be like, I didn't really wonder where you were. But I think 5-10 minutes would be okay. After that, people might question or call you, or you might want to apologize.
Yeah, as a generalization, I would say people are not expected to be exactly on time here. I think a certain amount of lateness is almost like you assume it will happen.
Right. I think part of it is in the big cities in Taiwan, everyone knows that there's a lot of traffic and stuff like that.
It's hard to find a place to park a scooter. or a car, that would be even more difficult. So everyone's like, okay, we know there's going to be things that make you a bit late. I think you could be maybe 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And especially, I mean, it's not hard to send someone a message.
Right,
so
exactly.
If you didn't send a message, you would probably be considered a bit more rude.
Yeah.
But if you let people know, you can kind of be 15, 20, it should be fine.
That's a good point. With cell phones and instant messaging, we can kind of let people know where we are anytime. So there really isn't a good excuse to not let people know that you will be a bit late.
Okay, and that's all the time we have. Thanks for watching. For English for You, I'm Pat.
I'm Mike.
We'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Did we finish on time?
Just about.
Good.
Vocabulary Review.
Vary. The baking time can vary because the cake will take longer to bake in a big oven. Industrial. Much of the town's pollution comes from its industrial area where the factories are. Countryside. Henry grew up in the countryside working on his uncle's farm. He's not used to the city. Flooding. The typhoon caused a lot of flooding in Andrea's basement. She spent hours pumping the water out. Profit. Jerry bought some rare video games in Japan and then sold them in the US for a profit. Summary. At the start of the second book of the story, there's a brief summary of what happened in the first book.
智慧小补帖
Flexibility. Generalization. Nevertheless.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作，活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net